at my daughter's funeral, with the scent of lilies still heavy in the air. Her ex-husband, the man who walked out on her 15 years ago, appeared. He strolled in and staked his claim to the 24 million she had earned, as if it were his by right. My heart seized in my chest, and the murmurs that spread through the room felt sharper than the cold reality of the casket being lowered into the earth. I stood there, trapped between profound sorrow and a burning rage, knowing this wasn't just a betrayal of me, but a desecration of my daughter's memory. What was about to happen would strip away every false face in that chapel, leaving no corner for anyone to hide in. The flowers at my daughter's funeral were still fresh, and her favorite song had just faded into silence when he made his entrance. Julian Pike, the man who had left her a decade and a half earlier, without so much as a parting word, without offering a single dollar for her care, without showing up for a single one of her many hospital stays when she was fighting for her life. He came through the chapel doors wearing expensive shoes, a tailored black suit, and a self-satisfied smirk that cast a chill over the entire assembly. He then spoke, his voice ringing out with practiced confidence. "I am here to take what is rightfully mine," he announced. "The 24 million estate that my wife left behind. As her legal husband, I possess every right to it." It felt as if all the oxygen had been pulled from the chapel. I heard gasps, saw people turning to each other in bewildered disbelief. But I couldn't tear my eyes from the casket. My daughter's name was engraved on the polished brass plaque, gleaming in the flickering candlelight. She hadn't been laid to rest for even 10 minutes, and this man was already trying to devour what remained of her life's work. It wasn't sadness that washed over me in that instant. It was a searing heat that built in my core, tightening around my throat. A silent fury that settled like a lead weight in my chest. I didn't turn to face him. Not right away. I kept my gaze fixed on the casket, pressing my hand against my suit jacket to keep it from trembling. My late wife always said I had the patience of a mountain. That day, I would need every ounce of it. Julian's lawyer, a young, visibly nervous man, stood beside him, shuffling through a stack of documents in a cheap-looking folder. I could hear the slight waver in his voice as he brought up marital laws, inheritance rights, and some obscure provision in a document he clearly hadn't reviewed with any real care. He was completely unaware that Julian had signed away any and all claims in their divorce agreement all those years ago. I glanced to my side. Arthur Vance, my lawyer, and the only other person in the room who knew what was about to unfold, gave me a subtle, reassuring nod. He was already reaching into his briefcase for a folder of his own. "Not yet," his look said. "Wait for the right moment." Throughout the chapel, the whispers had started to build. Julian's arrival had done more than just break the solemn quiet. It had shattered any pretense of a peaceful farewell. Mourners fidgeted in their seats. Some looked at the floor, others looked at me, their eyes filled with a mix of pity and expectation, as if they were waiting for me to collapse, to shatter into pieces. But I held my ground. Slowly, deliberately, I turned to face him. He didn't even blink. His gaze met mine, filled with the icy certainty of a man who was convinced he had already won. He lifted his chin, an arrogant gesture of pride. Perhaps he thought I would start weeping, pleading, or arguing with him right there in front of everyone. But I remained perfectly still. My stillness seemed to unnerve him, because his voice rose in volume. "I have no desire for a confrontation. I am simply here to claim what the law says is mine." At last I spoke, my voice steady and far colder than his. "You are not her husband, not in any way that matters." For a brief moment he seemed to falter. His lawyer leaned in and whispered something, flipping through a page. But I saw the flicker of doubt in Julian's eyes. He had been banking on my ignorance of the law. He had been counting on me being too overwhelmed by grief to put up a fight. He had treated this sacred space as his personal stage, certain I would be too broken to challenge his performance. Then Arthur stepped forward, moving with quiet authority, and handed the presiding official a certified copy of the divorce decree. It was stamped, sealed, and notarized. A complete waiver of all future claims to assets, finalized more than a decade prior. I didn't have to utter another word. The undeniable truth was there in black and white, and the profound silence that descended upon the room was more powerful than any shouting match could ever have been. Someone cleared their throat. I heard another person mutter, "Have mercy." Julian stood frozen, his lips pressed into a thin line, his eyes scanning the pews. He was looking for an ally, for someone to defend him. No one spoke up, and I just stood there, not feeling triumphant or smug, just resolute. I had spent 15 years raising my daughter by myself after he abandoned her with a mountain of medical bills and a shattered heart. I had been by her side for every chemotherapy session, every difficult surgery, every late-night call when the pain was so intense that the medicine couldn't keep up. He had been absent, a ghost, until the allure of her money was strong enough to bring him back. So when I finally turned to exit the chapel, I didn't spare him a second glance. I walked toward the doors with Arthur at my side, our footsteps measured and calm. I overheard someone murmur my name with sympathy. Another person whispered, "Justice." But I wasn't looking for sympathy, and I wasn't interested in justice. Not at that moment, because I knew this was far from over. If you believe that was the end of the story, you'll want to hear the rest. The next few hours were just the prelude, and what happened next made the scene at the funeral seem like a gentle warm-up. We didn't depart from the chapel in quiet. Behind me, I could hear the low hum of conversation rising, the sound of chairs moving, the groaning of old wooden pews as people began to stand and follow us out. Julian's voice, now sharp with a tremor of desperation, chased me through the doors like a bitter, broken echo. But I didn't break my stride. Outside, a cool wind had begun to blow. Arthur met me at the bottom of the stone steps and handed me a thick manila envelope without saying a word. I tucked it securely under my arm. We both understood it would be needed very soon. The funeral director, looking flustered and distressed, hurried over to apologize for the disturbance. I assured him it wasn't his fault. Death, I told him, doesn't always come with dignity. He seemed at a loss for words after that, and I didn't require any from him. We got into the car. Arthur took the wheel. I sat in the passenger seat, gazing out at the passing scenery, my hands clasped in my lap. I was breathing slowly, not out of calmness, but out of control. There's a significant difference. It was an 11-minute drive to the downtown law firm of Vance and Associates. Arthur's assistant had already prepared the conference room. She quietly closed and locked the door behind us. Arthur then laid 2 documents on the polished table, smoothing them out with his hands. The first was my daughter's updated last will and testament, dated just 9 months before she died. I had been sitting with her when she signed it, her hands frail but her signature firm. In it, she bequeathed every single one of her assets to me. The money, her company shares, the lakefront property, the apartment, the insurance policy, and even the intellectual property rights to an application she had developed during her final months. There was no mention of Julian anywhere, not a single word. The second document was the divorce settlement from 15 years ago. It contained a comprehensive waiver of any future rights to all assets, both current and those acquired in the future, all finalized and notarized. Arthur held the certified copy, along with the official county filing record. There were no loopholes, no gray areas. Still, Arthur's tone was cautious. Julian has no legal foundation to stand on, but he's audacious. I fully expect him to escalate this. I nodded, my jaw set, not with fear, but with unwavering focus. If Julian wanted to declare war, I was prepared to meet him on the battlefield. I had mourned my daughter with every fiber of my being. Now, I would defend everything she had worked for. I refused to let a man who had been gone for 15 years turn the final chapter of her life into a media circus. Arthur handed me a copy of the estate inventory, all neatly categorized. I scanned the list. Bank accounts, corporate stock, the house by the lake, the city condo, even her car. Then my eyes landed on the final item, a private video message recorded by my daughter, digitally stored and protected by attorney-client privilege. I hadn't been aware she had done that. Arthur tapped the folder. It's time. We drove to the courthouse, not for a scheduled hearing, but for a meeting Arthur had arranged with the supervising judge regarding emergency probate matters. It was a professional courtesy extended due to the estate's considerable size and the clear conflict surrounding it. The judge consented to an early review of the files and confirmed that Julian's claims would be immediately flagged as baseless upon filing. A temporary protective order was placed over the entire estate within the hour. Back outside, the sky had turned gray, the clouds gathering like a heavy curtain before a storm. Julian's lawyer called Arthur while we were still on the courthouse steps. Arthur put the call on speaker. The young man's voice was strained as he requested a meeting to explore a potential joint resolution. Arthur's response was firm. All future communication must be in writing, and Julian's disruptive behavior at a religious service would be formally documented in any response. I remained silent during the call. I didn't have to speak. For years, I had held my tongue for the sake of peace, for my daughter, for our family. That period of silence ended the second Julian uttered the words 24 million in front of her casket. That evening, back in the quiet of my home, I opened the private video file. There she was, sitting in the armchair by the window, the same one we used to sit in together when she was a little girl, and I would read to her. Her voice was serene, her words articulate. She talked about the foundation she wanted me to establish, about community scholarships, about a memorial garden she envisioned behind the local tech center. She spoke about me, about how I had always been her rock, about the strength she hoped I would continue to show even after she was gone. Then, toward the end of the recording, she said something that will stay with me forever. If he comes back, Dad, I need you to hold your ground. Not just for my sake, but for yours. He's the one who walked away from me. But you, Dad, you never left. You are worthy of everything I've left for you. I chose you. I played that final part again, and then I sat in the silence, the significance of her words resting on my chest like a firm but gentle hand. I didn't cry that night. There would be time for tears later. At that moment, I had a choice to make. I went to my desk and took out a notepad. I wrote down 3 names. 3 people who had stood by my daughter when Julian had not. 3 people who had seen things, who knew things. One of them had access to her medical records. Another had the archives of her development contracts. The third possessed personal emails that had never been shared. This was not about vengeance. It was about protecting her truth. I would not allow him to rewrite her story. Not while I was still breathing. Not while her voice still echoed in my ears. It had started at the funeral, but by the next day, this would transform into something else entirely. By the following morning, the news had begun to spread. Not about the money that would surface later, but about the confrontation in the church, about Julian's dramatic entrance, and about the tense silence that had followed. My phone started ringing before dawn. Old friends, distant relatives, people I hadn't spoken to in years, all calling to see how I was coping. But beneath their words of concern, I could detect something else. A subtle curiosity, a hint of doubt, as if they weren't entirely sure which side of the story to believe. I didn't answer the calls. I sat at my kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, watching the sky slowly brighten over the backyard. It was the same yard where my daughter had played as a child, where we'd grilled burgers on summer weekends, where I had planted rows of forget-me-nots along the fence after her first round of chemotherapy. It was a tranquil space, a good place to gather my thoughts. But the tranquility was short-lived. Around 10 o'clock that morning, Julian made a public post. It was a cropped photo of my daughter from years ago, a picture he had no right to use. His caption was brief. "Heartbroken to say goodbye to the love of my life. I pray that justice will prevail." Then the comments started pouring in. Most were from people who were either ignorant of the facts or didn't care to know them. They latched onto his narrative and amplified it. There were countless sympathy emojis and comments like, "So brave," "How unfair," and "A true tragedy." A few people suggested he get lawyers. One comment urged him to fight for what was his. That was the turning point. I had been prepared for a legal battle. I had all the necessary documents secured. But this was a different kind of fight. This was a battle for public perception. And if I had learned anything over the last 10 years, it was that people tend to believe the first story they hear, even if it's a complete fabrication. I sent a text to Arthur. He replied almost immediately. "Already tracking it. We're assembling a timeline for release." Within an hour, my daughter's CFO Marcus called. He informed me that he had already received calls from 2 journalists asking about the widower. Marcus said the word with a palpable bitterness, which I appreciated. I told him to hold fast. We weren't going to react impulsively. We were going to respond strategically. And there is a world of difference between the two. At noon, I drove downtown to meet Arthur. He had reserved a secluded room in a private library that had once been a bank. The walls were thick, the room soundproof. We couldn't risk being overheard. Our preparations were no longer just legal. They were about managing her reputation. Arthur outlined a 3-part strategy. First, solidify our legal position with the judge's temporary order and start the process for a permanent injunction to block any further interference from Julian. That was already underway. Second, compile all the personal evidence my daughter had left behind, along with documentation from her closest confidants. Marcus had emails and calendars. A friend named Leo had notarized copies of the divorce and property settlements. A nurse named David, who had cared for her in the ICU, had provided a written statement about her final week, specifically noting that Julian never once visited. The third part of the plan was something Arthur hadn't mentioned before. He proposed holding a public dedication, not just a press release or a legal filing, but a tangible, visible event, a public commitment to the foundation my daughter had wanted to establish. Arthur's point was that the most effective defense isn't always found in a courtroom. Sometimes it's found in a crowd. He was right. We selected a date 3 days away. The venue would be the main conference room at City Hall. The mayor had already voiced his support for the foundation months earlier, while my daughter was still alive and quietly laying the groundwork. We had all the correspondence, the permits, everything she had put in place. We were merely carrying on the work she had started. But I had no interest in creating a spectacle. I made it clear to Arthur that the focus had to remain on her, not on Julian, and not on me. It had to be about the cause, the mission, and the community impact. That was what truly mattered. Still, I knew Julian would likely show up, and I had to be prepared for that. That evening, I went to the old tech office where my daughter had worked. The space was dim now, the furniture draped in cloths. The staff had moved on after the company was acquired, but Marcus still had the keys. He met me at the entrance and led me to her old desk. Her chair was still there, as was the coffee mug with a small chip in the rim. On the whiteboard, there were faint, faded notes about app features, written in her distinct handwriting. Marcus handed me a small flash drive. He didn't say much, just pressed it into my hand with a firm nod. It contained the last 2 months of my daughter's private emails. He had already filtered out anything personal or irrelevant. What was left were communications about the foundation, her final medical directives, and her last correspondence with her legal team. Later that night, I sat at my own desk, the same one where I used to grade papers when I was a teacher, and I plugged in the drive. 3 emails were flagged with red stars. One was to Arthur, one was to Marcus, and one was to me. The one addressed to me had never been sent. She had saved it as a draft. It read, "Dad, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. And if he shows up, I know it's going to be difficult. But I need you to remember that you are the one who stayed. You were there when I couldn't walk, when I couldn't sleep, when I felt like I was more machine than person. You never, ever left my side. So don't let him rewrite the history that you and I lived through together. I chose you, not him. It was never him." In that moment, any lingering doubt I might have had evaporated. It wasn't that I had ever considered backing down, but something inside me solidified. I had been carrying around a heavy mix of pain and fury all week. Now I had absolute clarity. He wanted to use public opinion as a weapon. I would counter with the truth, not just in a court of law, but in front of every single person who had seen his post and believed his lie. In 3 days, I would stand in that room, and the story told would be hers, not his, and not even mine. It would be hers, completely and unequivocally. 3 days after the funeral, I entered City Hall through a rear entrance that Arthur had arranged. Less commotion, fewer prying eyes. The auditorium was already filling up with local journalists, tech industry investors, and community leaders. The mayor's office had confirmed his attendance, not to give a speech, but to show solidarity. That gesture meant more than words. The event was straightforward on paper. A dedication ceremony for the public launch of the Eleanor Vance Memorial Foundation. But everyone present knew it was much more than that. It was a declaration. The chairs were set up in neat rows facing a large projection screen. A banner near the stage read, "A Legacy of Purpose." A photo of my daughter was on the program, showing her with that quiet smile she always had when she was proud of something, but didn't want to draw attention to herself. That smile would have to speak for her now. Arthur and Marcus managed the press check-in at the door. Leo was positioned at a side table with binders of legal documents. David, the nurse, had volunteered to help escort some of the older guests to their seats. Everyone had a part to play. Everyone understood what was at stake. At 2 a.m., the doors were closed. At 5. Arthur walked to the podium and tapped the microphone once. He didn't smile. He wasn't there to win anyone over. "Good morning," he began. "We are gathered here today to honor the vision and values of a woman who lived with a quiet brilliance and left behind a blueprint for making a positive impact. What you are about to witness is not about loss. It is about intention, about clarity, and about truth." He then stepped away from the podium, and the auditorium lights dimmed. The screen lit up with a video. It was dated 5 weeks before her death. My daughter was sitting in a chair, her shoulders slightly slumped, her eyes weary but sharp and focused. The background was her home office, a room I knew well, filled with books, plants, and photographs. Her voice, when it came through the speakers, was steady. If you are watching this, it means I'm no longer around, but I wanted to take this opportunity to explain, in my own words, why I made the choices I did. I didn't want there to be any confusion. I didn't want any arguments. I wanted the truth to speak for itself. She went on to talk about her illness, her aspirations for the foundation, and her deliberate decision to leave all of her assets to me and only me, outlining her reasons. Her tone wasn't emotional or resentful. It was simply factual. He left, she stated plainly. When I needed him the most, he was gone. And when I built something valuable enough for him to return to, he came back. I cannot permit that to be the final word on my legacy. I am choosing the person who never left my side. The room was utterly silent when the video concluded. There was no coughing, no shifting in seats, just a profound stillness. I stood up, not because I wanted to, but because I had to. I walked deliberately to the podium. I had spoken in front of classrooms for 30 years. I had delivered eulogies, birthday toasts, and retirement speeches. But this was different. This wasn't about celebration. This was about drawing a line in the sand. I thanked everyone for their attendance. I acknowledged the mayor's presence. Then, I read the names of the first recipients of the foundation's scholarships. I listed the local schools that would be receiving STEM grants. I outlined the emergency medical relief fund that would bear my daughter's name. The audience listened intently. No one made a sound. Then, I addressed the situation head-on. Some of you may have seen posts on social media, heard rumors, or read comments. I will not engage with gossip. I will, however, respond with evidence. Marcus dimmed the lights once more. The screen displayed a series of emails from my daughter labeled, dated, and verified. They were communications with Arthur, with Marcus, and with me. They meticulously documented her intentions, her revised estate plans, her changes to insurance beneficiary, designations, everything. It was a foundation built on facts. Next, scanned legal documents appeared on the screen. The divorce decree, the settlement agreement, the waiver of rights. Highlighted in yellow was the specific line where Julian had signed his full and final consent to relinquish any and all future claims. Then came the final slide. It was a screenshot of an email Julian had sent to a close friend just 6 weeks before the funeral. The message had been anonymously forwarded to Arthur's office. In it, Julian had written, "I don't care what it takes. I'm going back to get what should have been mine all along. She owed me. And if her father wants a fight, I'm ready for it." I looked out at the audience. "That was his story," I said. "This is mine. And this foundation, this work, this legacy, it all belongs to the woman who earned it. Not the man who left her, nor the one who only came back when the money did." A few people began to clap, and then a few more joined in. By the time I stepped away from the podium, the entire room was applauding. I didn't smile or bow. I just gave a single nod and went back to my seat. Julian was there. I had noticed him slip in late. He was sitting in the back row, wearing sunglasses, his lips pressed into a thin, hard line. When the lights came up, he stood and walked out. He didn't cause a scene. He didn't say a word, but the sharp click of his shoes on the floor echoed as he left, as if he wanted to be heard, as if he wanted someone to follow him. No one did. Arthur leaned over to me. "He's going to retaliate." I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He would try, and we would be prepared. After the event concluded, people approached me, shook my hand, and shared stories about my daughter's stories I had never heard before. A classmate from her university days, a young entrepreneur she had mentored at a tech incubator, a father whose child had received free tutoring through the app my daughter had developed in her final year. That afternoon, a photograph from the event appeared in the news. It showed me standing at the podium, one hand on the lectern, the other holding the event program. On the screen beside me was my daughter's face. The caption read, "A father protects his daughter's legacy." And that was precisely what I had done publicly, clearly, without raising my voice, without showing rage, but with every single fact sharpened like a blade. It wasn't revenge. Not yet. But it was the beginning. The next morning, I awoke to an unusual quiet. There were no new text messages, no missed calls, no urgent emails from Arthur. But I didn't mistake this stillness for peace. It was the kind of charged silence that precedes a breaking storm. At 8:30 a.m., Arthur sent a brief message, "Stay off social media." His tone was always measured, but I could sense the urgency in those 4 words. I followed his advice, but I didn't have to wait long to find out why. Marcus called 30 minutes later. He got straight to the point. "Julian posted something. It's a video clip. Spliced together audio of your daughter, taken completely out of context. It makes it sound as though she regretted changing her will." He even added his own narration. I closed my eyes and took a deep, steadying breath. The event at City Hall had clearly rattled him. Now, he was resorting to dirty tactics. That afternoon, Arthur and I met again in the same private room at the old bank building. He had already downloaded the clip, created backups, transcribed the audio, and assigned a team to analyze the edits. There was no complete footage to compare it to, no record of those words in any of the raw files we possessed. It was a fabrication, but it was cleverly done, subtle enough to deceive people who were already inclined to believe his narrative. Arthur turned his laptop toward me and hit play. I heard my daughter's voice, but the sentences were choppy, phrases had been reordered, and natural pauses had been removed. She sounded hesitant, burdened. Then Julian's voice came in, layered over the audio. He spoke in a gentle, sympathetic tone, but every word was designed to imply that I had manipulated my daughter into excluding him from her will. He had even titled the video, "Let the Truth Be Heard." It was already gaining traction online. The comments were turning quickly. Strangers were calling him courageous. Others were calling me greedy. A few even suggested that I had isolated my daughter during her illness, driving away her friends and cutting her off from her former husband out of jealousy. Lies, I realized, can grow incredibly fast in fertile ground. But we did not panic. Arthur had already anticipated his next move. The first part of our response was straightforward. We would release the full, unedited video in question. The original, time-stamped and recorded in a single take. Leo had the master file on a secure drive. The second part of our response required more coordination. By that evening, Marcus had obtained permission from 3 of my daughter's former business partners to release internal communications, archived emails, meeting minutes, and messages from my daughter, in which she expressed her deep disappointment with Julian's behavior. In one message, dated 2 years before her death, she had written, "He reached out again, not to inquire about my health, not to apologize, but just to find out if the company's IPO had gone through. I'm so tired of pretending that people care when they clearly don't. I just don't have the energy for it anymore." Arthur compiled all of this into a single packet, which he labeled Behavioral Pattern Documentation. It was clean, professional, and utterly devastating. The following morning we held a press briefing. It wasn't a flashy event, no podium, just a conference room with a projector and printed information packets for everyone in attendance. Arthur began with a single powerful sentence. Misinformation is a dangerous thing. Here is the truth. Then, we played the full, original video of my daughter's message. It was unedited, calm, clear, and confident. She explained her decisions without any hesitation or confusion. She named me as her sole executor, her only caregiver, and her only remaining family. We distributed the written evidence. We took time to answer questions. We offered no sound bites, no spin, just the cold, hard facts. Julian did not respond publicly, but he didn't have to. The damage to his narrative was already becoming apparent. That night, one of the local blogs that had initially praised him issued a quiet retraction. Another took down his manipulated video. A third published side-by-side transcripts, clearly showing how the audio had been altered. Still, it didn't feel like enough. Not for me. The facts were now on my side, but I wasn't just chasing facts. I was chasing clarity. So, I made a decision. I called Marcus and asked him to release the internal memorandum my daughter had written during her final hospital stay. It was originally intended for the company's board of directors, but its tone was deeply personal. In it, she detailed her vision for the foundation, her reasons for establishing it in my name, and her explicit desire to distance the organization from anyone who had abandoned her. At the end of the memo, she had written, "I do not want my name to be associated with anything fake or shallow. If people are going to remember me, let it be for what I actually accomplished and for who actually stood by me." Arthur hesitated for a moment before agreeing. It was a powerful piece of evidence. It would make a strong impact, but it would also undoubtedly stir things up again. I told him that was precisely the point. The memo went live at noon, published with the full consent of the board and endorsed by the foundation. It didn't attack Julian directly, or even mention him by name, but its very existence exposed every lie he had told. By that evening, messages started to come in. They were from strangers, survivors, caregivers, people who had watched their own loved ones fade away slowly and alone. They wrote to say they understood, that they believed me. They had seen people show up at the last minute, just to lay claim to something they had not earned. But even that didn't bring me complete satisfaction, because I knew Julian wasn't finished. At 10:30 that night, Arthur called me again. "He's filed a motion to contest the will. He's claiming your daughter was coerced," he continued. "He's alleging that she lacked full mental capacity when she made the final changes." I asked Arthur how strong the claim was. He said it was weak, but it would compel a formal response. It would initiate the discovery process. It would open up her records. I told him I wasn't afraid of her records. Let him dig. Because the deeper he dug, the more of the truth he was so desperately trying to bury would be unearthed. This was no longer just about a lie. This was about character. And character has a much longer reach than money. He wanted a war. I had warned him. And now he had it on paper, on the record, and in front of everyone. The official filing arrived late on a Thursday. Arthur forwarded the motion to me at 9:42 p.m. Just as I expected, he would cleanly formatted, annotated, and with a brief note at the end, "You don't need to respond yet, but you should see this." I read every single page. Julian's legal team accused me of exerting undue influence. They claimed my daughter had been emotionally manipulated, that I had intentionally isolated her, that I had coerced her into rewriting her will at a time when her judgment was supposedly clouded by medication and illness. They painted me as controlling, overbearing, and ruthless. I sat there alone at my kitchen table, The same table where I had once helped her with school projects and spelling tests. The same table where I had shaved her head for the first time after her chemo treatments began, trying to make her laugh as her hair fell away in clumps. And now, on that very table, lay a document accusing me of stealing from her, of bending her will to my own, of using her pain for my personal gain. I allowed myself to feel it all. Not the anger, not at first, just the grief. It settled deep in my chest, like an old, familiar weight returning. Something I thought I had come to terms with, but it came rushing back that night, because reading that motion was like reliving every single hour I had spent by her side. Every time I had held a sick bag in one hand and her hand in the other, every time I had pushed the morphine pump when the nurse wasn't quick enough, they called me ruthless. But they weren't there when I read to her to distract her from the nausea. They weren't there when I changed her sheets at 3 a.m. They weren't there when I massaged her feet to help her fall asleep. They weren't there the night she woke up screaming, confused, and not knowing what year it was. They weren't there the afternoon she looked at me, with perfect clarity in her eyes, and made me promise to ensure he never received a single cent. But I was. So I let that heavy feeling sit with me. I didn't fight it or push it away. I poured myself a glass of water. I sat perfectly still. I let their words wash over me, and in that moment, I remembered exactly who I was, not the man they described on paper, but the father who had stayed. The next morning, I met Arthur at his office. He had already begun drafting our official response. But before we filed anything, we sat in silence for a few minutes. He looked at me as if he were waiting for me to crack, to lash out in anger, or to break down completely. I did none of those things. I simply said, "Let's make this clean, and let's make it final." He nodded in agreement. We decided to prepare the affidavits. We would include David's testimony as her nurse, Marcus's statement as her CFO, and Leo's notarized records. We would also include the complete email chains that documented my daughter's wishes, her voice recordings, her private memorandum, everything. But I felt that the next step shouldn't be purely legal. I needed something more personal. I told Arthur that I wanted to write a letter not for the court, but for the foundation, for the community. He was hesitant at first, but he agreed. That weekend, I sat down with a pen and paper and wrote it out in longhand. I kept it simple and direct. "I am not my daughter's voice," I wrote, "but I am an echo of what she believed in. She believed in fairness, in decency, and in a truth that does not need to shout to be heard. She built what she built, not for fame or for legacy, but because she wanted to solve problems and leave something useful behind. I stayed by her side. I did not do it for a reward. I did not do it for recognition. I did it because I loved her and because I believe in what she wanted this foundation to become." The following week, Arthur filed our full rebuttal. It was significantly longer than the original motion, more detailed, and heavily supported with documentation. Then we waited. During that time, Julian did exactly what I had expected. He went to the press, gave interviews, and played the victim. He spoke of love, memory, and heartbreak. He shared carefully selected photos. He even managed to produce tears on cue, but something had changed. The public was no longer so quick to believe him. Some news articles started using the word alleged. Some online commenters began to reference the unedited video, the emails, and the stark contradictions between his claims and the documented evidence. Truth may not always travel fast, but it moves with a steady, relentless pace. Arthur informed me that it could take weeks for the judge to review the motion. He warned me that Julian might try to push for a hearing, attempt to draw out the process, and try to drain our resources with time. I told him I wasn't concerned. I had already waded through far worse. I had waited for the results of blood tests and scans. I had waited through the long nights, listening to the beeping of hospital machines. Waiting for court dates and legal reviews didn't frighten me. Not in the way that watching your child fade away, inch by inch, does. During those days, I kept myself occupied. I spent my mornings at the Foundation's office, reviewing grant proposals, meeting with the new director, and organizing scholarship committees. I made sure that the work continued to move forward. I kept my hands busy to prevent my heart from clenching in anxiety. One afternoon, while I was looking over some budget reports, a volunteer brought me a letter. It was handwritten with no return address. Inside was a simple, powerful message. You are not alone. I believe you. I watched my own sister be torn apart by someone just like him. Thank you for speaking up. There was no signature, just those few lines. But it was a poignant reminder that what we were doing wasn't just about property or inheritance. It was about setting the story straight, not with anger, but with focus, not with volume, but with proof. That was something he had never understood. He believed that power came from making the most noise, but I had learned that real power, true power, comes from consistency, and I was prepared to be consistent until the very end. The court's decision arrived on a Wednesday morning. It was a quiet affair. No television crews, no screaming headlines about justice or fraud. It was just a simple notification from Arthur, informing me that the court had issued its ruling. He had forwarded the official 212-page document to my email. I read every single word. The motion to contest the will was dismissed in its entirety. There would be no trial, no hearing. The judge had found the evidence to be unequivocally clear. My daughter had been of sound mind. She had made her decisions with deliberate intent. There was no evidence of coercion, no manipulation, and no external pressure. Julian's claims were described as unfounded, speculative, and, in several instances, intentionally misleading. That last phrase, intentionally misleading, was the most significant. In the language of the court, it meant more than just losing a case. It meant exposure. It meant vulnerability. It meant there would be consequences. The next steps unfolded more quickly than even Arthur had anticipated. Within 48 hours, the court ordered a hearing to review potential sanctions against Julian's legal team for misuse of the legal process, abuse of the system, and attempting to mislead a probate court with altered materials. The hearing was scheduled for the following week. At first, I didn't plan to go. I had told myself that the dismissal of his claim was enough, that I didn't need to witness the aftermath, that I had achieved what I set out to do. My daughter's wishes were protected, and her legacy was secure. But 2 days before the hearing, Arthur called. He told me that Julian had submitted a last-minute request to have the hearing closed to the public. He claimed emotional distress, argued that it would damage his reputation, and that it would interfere with his ability to find work and rebuild his life. The judge denied his request. That's when I decided I would be there. I arrived early and took a seat in the back row. The courtroom was small, with no media present, just the involved parties, their lawyers, and a few court employees. Arthur sat beside me, his posture relaxed but attentive. Julian came in 5 minutes before the proceedings began, dressed in a sharp suit that seemed out of place in the stark setting. His hair was slicked back, and he deliberately avoided scanning the room. He knew I was there, but he refused to look at me. The judge entered, and the hearing commenced. There was no high drama, no theatrical speeches, just a slow, methodical deconstruction of what had transpired. They reviewed the motion Julian had filed, the video he had posted, the way it had been manipulated, the affidavits that directly contradicted his version of events, the financial records, the legal history. His pattern of communication with people close to my daughter, the timing of his reappearance, and his social media posts both before and after the funeral. They took it all apart, piece by piece, until there was nothing left. No supporting evidence, no defense, no ground for him to stand on. His lawyer tried to argue that his client had been misguided, that he hadn't fully understood the legal risks, that he had acted out of grief. But the judge cut him off. "The grief of losing a woman you abandoned does not excuse the manipulation of this court," he said. Those were the judge's words, not Arthur's and not mine. The judge then turned his focus to the lawyer's own conduct. He questioned him about the origin of the edited video, the decision to file the motion without disclosing the complete estate documentation, and the statements made to the media that had implied I was under some kind of investigation. The lawyer's answers were evasive and unsatisfactory. By the end of the hearing, it was clear that sanctions would be recommended. Julian's lawyer would face a formal review by the State Bar Association. Julian himself would be required to pay all legal fees associated with our response to his motion. The amount was substantial. The court also issued a freeze on his bank accounts pending payment. It wasn't a jail sentence or a public scandal, but it was the legal system's version of a final reckoning. I watched his face as the judge read the decision aloud. His expression remained unchanged, but his hands betrayed him, clenching and unclenching one after the other. When the judge adjourned the hearing, Arthur and I stood up. We didn't approach him or linger. But as we were walking toward the exit, Julian turned his head just slightly. It wasn't enough to make direct eye contact, but it was enough for me to see the hollow, defeated look in his eyes. He had walked into this situation believing he could bend reality to his will. He left with his name tarnished in official court records, his finances frozen, and his story completely dismantled. That afternoon, Arthur sent a brief, professional statement to the Foundation's press contacts. The Eleanor Vance Foundation respects the court's findings and remains steadfastly committed to carrying forward the mission defined by its founder. We now consider this matter to be resolved. There was no triumphant tone, no gloating, just a sense of finality. I sat in my garden that evening, alone, on the same bench where my daughter and I had once sat after she received her first clean scan. I took a deep breath of the quiet air. It wasn't peace, not yet, but it was quiet. The kind of quiet that comes after a door has been firmly shut. The kind that signifies you have endured something difficult and there is nothing more that needs to be said. The following week, I received a letter. It was handwritten, with no return address, just my name on the envelope. No one sends handwritten letters anymore, but I knew who it was from before I even opened it. It wasn't a confession or an apology. It wasn't even a threat. It was a request written on a single line. I need 5 minutes of your time, just to say one thing in person. I set the letter aside and let it sit on my nightstand for 2 days. I didn't show it to Arthur. I didn't call anyone about it. And then, one afternoon, I called the number he had scribbled at the bottom of the page. I told him to meet me at the public greenhouse on Sycamore Street. Midday, neutral territory, no cameras, no prying eyes. When I got there, he was already seated on a bench near the orchid display. The choice of location felt almost intentional. Orchids don't vie for attention. They sit in quiet elegance and command it. I approached slowly and sat down beside him, leaving a noticeable space between us. For nearly a full minute, neither of us spoke. Then he broke the silence, not with an apology or even a softened tone. His voice was clipped and controlled, but not cold. He said he was angry that he had been written out of his own history, that the world would only remember him as the man who had left, that my daughter had moved on without him and found a new sense of purpose. He said he had thought that maybe, just maybe, he could reclaim a piece of that story by stepping back into the picture after she was gone. Not for the money, he insisted, but for relevance, for my image, for the right to not be forgotten. I didn't interrupt him. I let him say his piece. Then I looked at him and told him the truth. Being forgotten is not a punishment, I said. It's a consequence. You become absent from people's lives when you choose to be absent from their pain. I reminded him that my daughter had spent the better part of a decade recovering from the damage he had left behind. Her dignity wasn't a prize to be won. It was something she had earned through sheer grit, through long nights filled with silence, through friendships she had forged from the ground up, and with a kind of quiet strength that never makes the headlines. I told him that a legacy isn't built on drama. It's built on presence, on staying, on showing up when there is absolutely nothing to be gained. He looked away, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench. Then he said he had no plan left, that the court orders had wiped out what little he had, that he wasn't there to ask for help, but that he didn't know what to do next. I believed him, not because I had any trust in him, but because desperation has a distinct sound, and I had lived through enough to recognize it. I didn't offer him any comfort, but I didn't add any cruelty either. I stood up and told him to take care of himself. I made it clear that this would be the last time we ever spoke, and that if he ever tried to contact the foundation, the board, or my family again, I would respond with the full force of the law. His mouth opened slightly, as if he wanted to protest, but he said nothing. He just gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. I walked away, past the orchids, past the glass walls streaked with the spring sunlight, and I didn't look back. Later that evening, I sat at my dining table with a cup of tea, a folder of foundation documents, and a photograph I hadn't looked at in a long time. It was of my daughter, taken the year before she passed away. She was standing outside a small elementary school in a rural town where she had funded a new literacy center through the foundation. She wasn't smiling, but there was something solid and sure in her posture, a calm certainty in the way she stood, surrounded by children who couldn't yet comprehend the weight she carried. I studied that photograph, and for the first time in a while, I didn't feel the sharp ache of grief. I felt something else, a kind of deep gratitude that she had managed to build something that could not be stolen, edited, or twisted. A legacy that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with the choices she had made. I leaned back in my chair and closed the folder. The house was quiet, but not in the same way as before. Not the hollow kind of quiet. This was different. There were still challenges ahead, legal filings, press inquiries, trustees to train. But this moment, this stillness, was mine. The man who had walked into that greenhouse had been chasing shadows, a version of himself that had never really existed, a place in a story he had long since abandoned. But I wasn't chasing anything. I had stopped running a long time ago. And now, I had the clarity of someone who no longer owed silence to anyone. The auditorium was filled to capacity. It wasn't the kind of place I ever thought I would find myself in again at 71 years old, not after my daughter's memorial service 2 years prior. But this time, the lights were brighter, the cameras were sharper, and the silence in the room was even more profound than before. It was the official launch of the Community Library Initiative, built with the first wave of funding from the foundation established in my daughter's name. It was a project that Julian had tried and failed to attach his name to in recent weeks, sending letters to sponsors and even attempting to rebrand the initiative through his own fabricated press releases. I had let him try. I had watched quietly, as his delusions piled up emails sent to the mayor's office, interview requests with local media under false pretenses. He had tried to position himself as the visionary behind a movement he had absolutely no part in. But today was the day that his narrative would end, publicly, with no way for him to edit or erase what was about to happen. The mayor opened the event with some predictable remarks about education and community equity. The head of the foundation said a few words, and then the microphone was mine. I stood up slowly. My knees were a firm reminder that I wasn't a young man anymore, but my back was straight and my voice was steady. I started by speaking my daughter's name, not as a victim, not as a tragedy, but as a person who had built bridges where others had burned them. I spoke of her deep commitment to education, of her quiet investments in underserved schools, of her belief that books could give children a language for dreams they hadn't yet learned to articulate. Then I paused. I turned slightly toward the left side of the room. He was there, Julian, sitting in the third row, wearing a dark blazer and the same expression he always wore when he thought he still had some leverage. Tight lips, alert eyes, controlled breathing. I held his gaze. I said the next words slowly, with deliberate precision. That legacy is not a costume that you can put on when it's convenient. It is not for sale, and it cannot be stolen. I continued, explaining that the foundation had been approached by individuals claiming ties they had never earned, attempting to leverage grief for personal gain. I announced that these individuals were now permanently barred by a court order from having any contact with the foundation, its assets, or its representatives. And finally, I declared that the library and all future projects would move forward under a new name, not just my daughter's, but the names of the children she had taught, the communities she had served, the ones who had shown up when others had vanished. The room remained silent. There were no gasps, no applause, just a heavy awareness that something irreversible had just taken place. I stepped down from the stage, the tip of my cane tapping lightly against the floor as I walked back to my seat. I didn't look at him again, but I felt it, the shift, the final unraveling. He didn't move for a long time, just sat there, frozen, as the event continued on around him. Afterward, several board members came up to thank me. The mayor shook my hand. Reporters asked for a quote, which I politely declined. My work was done. But the true weight of that moment didn't fully settle in until I returned home and found a message waiting for me. It was from one of the foundation's attorneys. She had received a desperate email from Julian's lawyer in the hours following the event, demanding a reconsideration and claiming that my statements had defamed his client. Attached to the email were images of a cease and desist letter he had attempted to issue. It was weak and empty. The attorney assured me that we had nothing to be concerned about. Everything I had said had been reviewed, approved, and was legally ironclad. But it wasn't the legal protection that mattered to me. It was the silence. Because for the first time since my daughter's funeral, Julian had no more tools left to twist the story. His name had been wiped from every narrative he had tried to force his way into, not by revenge, but by truth. Later that night, Arthur stopped by. He had been at the event as well, sitting quietly in the back. He didn't say much, just poured us both some tea and sat across from me. Then he said, "That was the most quiet display of fury I have ever witnessed." I nodded. That's all it needed to be. Not a spectacle, not a shouting match, just a mirror, held up long enough that the reflection could no longer be denied. And in that reflection, he finally saw what he truly was. A footnote in someone else's life. A life he had long ago abandoned. The storm had passed, but I wasn't left shattered. I was still standing, firm and finally free. And now, the only name etched in stone wasn't his. It was hers. The repercussions were swift, more so than even I had anticipated. It began with the grant revocations. Two prominent education nonprofits withdrew their pending collaborations with Julian's so-called mentorship program. They issued tactful but clear statements, citing inconsistencies in his claimed experience and a lack of transparency in his fund allocation. By the middle of the week, local donors had also quietly withdrawn their support. The foundation's office was inundated with emails. Parents who had once believed Julian was close to my daughter were now demanding explanations for the letters they had received from him months earlier. Letters in which he claimed to be relaunching a private school project. He alleged she had started a project that had never existed. But it wasn't until the fraud investigation was launched that the ground truly gave way beneath him. One of the board members of the new Community Library Initiative had a daughter who worked as a state-level auditor. She had seen the footage of my speech and made a few phone calls. What followed was a quiet but meticulous examination of Julian's financial filings, tax records, and property deeds. It didn't take long to find the discrepancies. Unreported income, invoices sent to shell nonprofits that redirected funds to a personal account in his cousin's name, a 2-year trail of phantom donors, and cash-based events with no itemized expense logs. It quickly escalated from suspicion to a subpoena, and Julian knew it. I didn't gloat. I didn't send him any letters or make any phone calls. I didn't need to. But I did read the full 17-page report when it was sent to me, detailing every deceitful maneuver he had attempted to pull off behind the scenes. Every lie, every forged affiliation, every time he had pretended to be acting on behalf of my late daughter, just to siphon off sympathy or money. He was stripped of his right to operate any nonprofit organization in the state and was fined heavily. His personal accounts were frozen pending further investigation. His passport was revoked, and the real blow came with the public filing. His name, his misdeeds, his fabricated legacy, all laid bare in official state documents. By the second week, the story had hit the local press. His name began trending on social media, but not with messages of support. It wasn't even outrage. It was just silence. No one came to his defense. Even his own daughter, a quiet young woman named Camille who had stayed out of the conflict, released a brief online statement clarifying that she had been estranged from her father for years and had no involvement in any of his activities. It shattered whatever remained of the illusion Julian had so carefully constructed around himself. He wasn't the grieving widower of a fallen hero. He was just a man who had left a marriage, abandoned a sick partner, and returned only when he smelled money. One morning, Arthur handed me an envelope with no return address. Inside was a crumpled old photograph of my daughter when she was about 6 or 7, from a school play. Julian was in the background, barely visible, but it was enough to see that he had once stood near her, at least once, long before everything fell apart. Underneath the photo was a handwritten note. I didn't read it right away. I left it on the kitchen counter for 2 days, untouched. Then, quietly, I opened it. It was not an apology. It was a plea. A single sentence. "You've taken everything. I have nowhere left to go." I folded the note, placed it back under the picture, and tucked them both into the back of a drawer I rarely opened. There was no satisfaction in his downfall, no joy in his isolation, but there was clarity. A person who builds their life on a foundation of lies cannot blame others when the truth inevitably brings it all crashing down. Later that week, I received a call from the city office. They wanted to offer me a position on the advisory council for senior outreach programs, a part-time role focused on helping older men navigate financial decisions, legal protections, and family conflicts. Apparently, my story had quietly reached more ears than I had realized. I accepted the offer, not for the visibility, but for the sense of purpose. Because when I sat across from those men, with their quiet faces, tired eyes, and gentle hands, I saw versions of myself, versions that still wondered if silence was the safest path, if forgiveness meant erasing the past, if dignity was something they had to trade away for peace. And I told them, simply, that clarity is not cruelty, that boundaries are not a betrayal, and that speaking the truth does not make you hard, it makes you whole. I never mentioned Julian's name. He had become irrelevant to the work. Not forgotten, but no longer the shadow looming in my doorway. At the end of that week, I walked past the old cemetery where my daughter's name was etched into the memorial wall. And for the first time, I sat on the bench beside it, not in mourning, but in a state of restoration. The sun was setting, casting long golden lines across the grass. I leaned back, closed my eyes, and just breathed. There was no vengeance left in my chest, no fire in my throat, only space. A quiet, sacred space. And I knew that whatever came next, it would begin from here. I never expected to see him again. But life, in its own twisted way, had other plans. It was a Thursday afternoon in early spring when I saw him outside the courthouse. Julian. He was standing on the other side of the sidewalk, just past the bench near the parking lot. His coat looked too thin for the wind, and his hair was pulled back in a loose, untidy knot. There was no makeup, no carefully constructed mask, just his face, looking tired and raw. I had just finished giving a short presentation at a community safety panel, outlining new resources for older citizens at risk of financial abuse. On my way out, I had stopped to drop off some paperwork for the new outreach initiative. The timing, it seemed, had been arranged by some unseen force. Our eyes met across the distance. He didn't move. Neither did I. There was no crowd, no cameras, just two men on opposite ends of a story that had finally unraveled. He started walking toward me slowly, his steps hesitant, as if he wasn't sure his legs would carry him the whole way, or perhaps he was hoping they wouldn't. When he finally stood before me, he didn't speak. He just looked at me. Not with anger, not with apology, but with a quiet, hollow ache in his eyes. "I'm not here for a second chance," he said eventually. I waited. "I just wanted to look you in the eye one last time." I nodded. He paused, glancing at the courthouse behind me, then back at my face. "I thought I was owed something," he said, his voice softer now. "For what I lost, for the life I didn't get." His voice trembled, not for dramatic effect, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. "I told myself you were cruel," he continued, "that you were trying to erase me from her story. But maybe you weren't. Maybe I was never really a part of it to begin with." A long silence stretched between us. He didn't cry. I didn't speak. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded letter. It wasn't sealed. He held it out to me. "I wrote this for you a while ago," he said. "I never sent it." I didn't take it. "I don't need your letter," I said plainly. He dropped his arm, letting the paper fall to the ground between us. And that was it. No tears, no dramatic exit. He turned and walked back across the sidewalk, disappearing into the blur of people who didn't know him, didn't care, and wouldn't look twice. And I let him go. There was no weight in my chest, no surge of satisfaction, just a profound stillness. Closure, I've come to learn, doesn't always arrive with final words or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes in the form of no longer needing an apology, no longer needing to prove anything at all. That night, I sat on my back porch. The sky was a soft lavender, fading into dusk. Arthur brought me some tea, and we sat in quiet companionship for a while. I told him about the encounter, just the facts, with no embellishment. He didn't ask for any more details. Instead, he said something I'll never forget. "You didn't break him," he said. "You revealed him." And it was true. Julian had meticulously crafted his own downfall with every lie he thought would never catch up to him. I had simply refused to play the part he had written for me. Later that week, the last batch of letters from the foundation arrived. Some were handwritten, others typed. They were messages from men all across the country who had heard my story through the community bulletin, through quiet conversations, through whispers passed between friends. They didn't ask for money or advice. They simply shared their own stories of betrayal, of stolen pensions, of children who had taken and taken until there was nothing left. But woven through their grief was something else. A quiet, flickering resolve to draw their own lines, to reclaim their own space, to speak, even if their voices trembled. I answered every single letter, sometimes with just a sentence, sometimes with pages. I didn't preach or console. I simply acknowledged them. And in that exchange, something shifted. This was no longer just about me. It wasn't even about Julian. It was about the quiet war that too many men had fought behind closed doors, believing they were utterly alone. They weren't. I wasn't. And somehow, that was enough. That was the real justice. Not the headlines or the court filings, but the ripple effect, the quiet revolution happening one conversation at a time. By the end of the week, I had filed the last of the grant approvals, signed off on the final forms for the spring workshop series, and set aside the voice recorder for the following month's testimonial interviews. I didn't look back, not because I was running from anything, but because I was finally walking forward, without the weight, without the war, just with the knowledge that I had told the truth and had survived it. The next spring, I planted roses. Not the delicate, fragile kind that wilt after a single strong wind, but the thick-stemmed, climbing variety, meant to hold their own through both sun and storm. I chose a deep crimson for one side of the porch and a pale ivory for the other. The balance pleased me. Fire and grace, strength and peace. I had needed both. By then, the house was quiet again, but it was the right kind of quiet. The kind of quiet you earn after a long and messy life. Arthur had gone back to teaching part-time, and I had settled into my weekly meetings with the community board, mentoring younger men who found themselves caught in storms similar to the one I had weathered. I didn't tell them how to survive. I just reminded them that they already had. The foundation we had built from the lawsuit funds had taken on a life of its own. Within months, we had offers to partner with shelters, legal aid groups, and even a few churches that had, for too long, turned a blind eye. For every rejection letter I received from a glossy institution that was uncomfortable with our direct tone, I received 2 more handwritten notes from men who finally felt seen, and I had no interest in being palatable anymore. I had spent too many years folding myself into a version of manhood that didn't ruffle feathers, a version that apologized before speaking, that made coffee before saying no, that handed over its power under the illusion of love. Those days were over. Julian never came back, not even for the final verdict announcement. His assets had been seized, his professional licenses suspended. I never cheered, not out loud. But when I stood in that courtroom and listened to the judge declare my rights fully restored, I allowed myself the smallest smile I had ever worn. Not because he had lost, but because I hadn't. That was enough. Arthur moved in with me not long after. He said his apartment was too quiet and his knees were too tired to keep climbing 3 flights of stairs. We drank our tea at 5 o'clock every evening. We would laugh about the old headlines that still occasionally made the rounds. The father who took down his daughter's husband. But we never needed to explain what had really happened. The people who mattered already knew. Sometimes I would come across old photos buried in boxes, a younger me, a younger woman beside me, her eyes full of promise and hope. I never burned them. I never hid them. I simply placed them in the cedar chest at the foot of my bed, where old memories could live without needing to be resurrected. By summer, the roses had begun their ascent, curling around the porch rails like arms embracing a future that was not yet written. The neighbors started stopping by more often, some with pies, some with questions, some just to sit in the shade and breathe in the peace that now resided on that hill. I didn't give speeches. I didn't wear victory like a crown. I just showed up, day after day, as myself whole, weathered, and wide awake. Because that, I had come to realize, was the real triumph. Not the headlines, not the settlement, but the quiet reclaiming of oneself, the rebuilding of a life not around the pain but beyond it. And in that space, I found joy. Not the loud, boisterous kind, but the kind that hums softly just beneath the surface, like the wind through the leaves, like laughter shared in low voices over dinner, like the forgiveness not given to others, but offered gently to yourself. I still get letters sometimes, from men I've never met, from sons watching their fathers suffer, from fathers watching their children become strangers. They don't ask for magic, just for the truth. And I give it to them, plain and unwavering, the kind that says, you are not alone. You never were. If you have ever felt dismissed, taken advantage of, or quietly erased by the people you love the most, know this. Your story doesn't end there. You can draw the line. You can take back the pen. And even if the world never applauds you, your own peace is the loudest applause there is. I've told my story. Now,